What's up, what's up, what's up? It's your boy Domuto. We're back with another video. Today we're watching DygoKnight. Why Kishimoto hated writing Shikamaru. He hated writing Shikamaru. Why? Shikamaru one of the best characters in Naruto. Like, he's one of the smartest characters in Naruto as well. One of the cooler ones too, man. You know what I'm saying? Like, definitely one of my favorites. So why I want to know, why does Kishimoto hate it writing Shikamaru? It did feel like later on. Let me see. He had a big spot. Yeah, he had some big moments in Naruto, Shippuden. I haven't rewatched Boruto, but I seen him in the world. Like, I seen like 100 episodes of Boruto, so I don't know what happened after 100 episodes. But he seemed pretty prevalent in the story of Naruto. So let's see what's going on, man. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and shoot. Let's get some more Naruto content in, man. You know what I'm saying?
Shikamaru was Kishimoto's least favorite character to write. Not because he didn't enjoy the character himself, or because the character was annoying, and not even because of the character development that Shikamaru went on. No, the reason why Shikamaru was a nightmare to Kishimoto was because the character's mechanics. More specifically, how Shikamaru's fights worked. Shikamaru is one of the most intelligent characters in the Naruto series, and his fights should showcase that. It was his entire shtick, fighting very strategic fights, and beating his opponents by sheer intelligence. The problem is that whenever you come up with a very cool way for Shikamaru to win the fight, the next time he fights, you're gonna have to come up with something even more clever. And that's something hard to do that also takes time for you to develop properly. You not only have to come up with a very interesting strategy for Shikamaru to come up with, but you also need to come up with the powers of his opponents, powers that will synergize well with Shikamaru's abilities in order to make the fight very strategic. So creating interesting scenarios and interesting powers to interact with Shikamaru's powers was not something Kishimoto loved doing. Well, he may have loved the results, but the process was very hard. And that may be one of the reasons why Shikamaru didn't have that many fights in the series. Now, fun fact, Shikamaru was supposed to win the Chunin exam's final round. He was going to win the tournament. That was Kishimoto's original intention, but his editor told him to cut the Chunin exam short and start the Orochimaru invasion right away, in order to keep the pacing of the story going, which it works really well when it happens, but it would have been very interesting to see Shikamaru getting through the final. But you can think how difficult this would be, because if Shikamaru has to fight 3 fights and win all 3 of them to pass the Chunin exams by winning the tournament, then each subsequent fight will have to be more strategic and clever than the other one, which may be an unfair bar for Kishimoto to put on himself, but that's how he felt. He needed to one-up the previous fights that Shikamaru had with his next one, and he came up with some very
So I get it. Okay. So pretty much, like, Shikamaru is a very thought-out fighter. He thinks before he do. He, he figure out his opponent and everything. Which, like I said, somebody's opposite of that. Naruto, who goes in, basically part 1 Naruto, who goes in headstrong, and figure out how to win later. You know what I'm saying? So, which you can't do. You can't just change up the fight style of Shikamaru out of nowhere. You can't just change it up. You can't just be like, oh, I'm just going in here strong and hopefully I'll win. Like, no. You gotta keep being strategic with Shikamaru. So I can see how that's pretty hard to do, how to figure out how to use them in fights and stuff. Okay.
Interesting things to do that, which we're gonna be going over right now. Every single major Shikamaru fight has a catch, and it's very interesting to dissect how Kishimoto came up with those abilities and environments in order to make the fight feel very intelligent. The first time we ever see Shikamaru fighting is in the Forest of Death, but it's not a 1v1 fight. He fights with his team against the Sound team, and honestly, he doesn't do a whole lot. He wasn't even the leader of his squadron at that point. Ino was leading them. That was part of Shikamaru's character development. He didn't want to push himself too hard. He didn't want the responsibilities of leadership, but he eventually learns those things in the end of Naruto Part 1 when he fails to retrieve Sasuke with his team. But that first fight wasn't exactly a masterpiece from Shikamaru. He just used the Shadow Possession a couple of times and didn't do anything too genius with it. But you start to see a little bit more of his intellect with his first 1v1 fight, which is his fight against Kin in the preliminaries of the Chunin exams. Now, as far as Shikamaru fights go, this one is very simple. It is his first fight, and you get a glimpse that this guy is a good strategist strategist, but he doesn't feel like a genius or anything. Shikamaru deduces what Kin is doing by tossing needles with and without bells in order to confuse his senses, and he manages to catch her with a shadow possession jutsu using the wire's shadow, which was pretty clever, and then he bumps her head against the wall via the shadow possession and wins the fight. And the fight establishes that the shadow possession is not completely invincible, otherwise Shikamaru wouldn't have thrown that shuriken in order to dodge it so that Kin can hit her head on the wall, because if he only bent backwards, she could have resisted that and not hit her head on the wall, and therefore not losing the fight by knocking herself unconscious. But we also see that the shadow possession can be very tricky, and Shikamaru can use several other shadows in order to extend his own. And that's the thing about Shikamaru's shadow possession and his overall abilities. They are simple in effect, so there are several ways he can use them. If you look at Shikamaru's arsenal, even when he is in Naruto Shippuden and has all those new jutsus, he has the shadow possession, which he can control somebody else. He has a shadow strangulation jutsu, which he can use the shadows to, well, choke people. And then he has the shadow needles, which he can use to pierce targets, toss kunais, even hold some things with a shadow like a tendril. But as far as jutsus go, there isn't a whole lot you can do with them. So Shikamaru has to do a lot of thinking in order to implement his abilities properly. And Kishimoto also needs to do a lot of thinking in order for Shikamaru to feel intelligent and use his pretty limited arsenal in an interesting and intelligent looking way. It's much easier to come up with very clever tactics for a character whenever the character has a lot of abilities in his arsenal, so you can pull off all sorts of combos. But when the character is limited like Shikamaru in terms of his abilities, then you have to think a lot about the environment of the fight, about the opponent, and how the opponent's abilities are going to interact, and this is one of the reasons why it was so difficult for Kishimoto to write Shikamaru. Now, we don't really see this in display very much in the fight against Kin, first because it was really fast and kind of easy for Shikamaru, but the fight against Temari is a completely different beast. It's in that fight that we get introduced to the concept that Shikamaru is an absolute genius when it comes to strategy, and it's one of those fights you just think, wow, this was really well thought out by Kishimoto. So if you think about it, Temari's power set isn't exactly very versatile, and it's not something that will directly interact with Shikamaru's shadow possession, meaning that Temari wasn't exactly a character Kishimoto crafted to fight Shikamaru, so he couldn't make Shikamaru's powers counter the wind style Temari possesses in a very interesting way, kind of like he does with Neji countering Kidomaru's webs with his gentle fist. So what does Kishimoto do to make the fight look really intelligent if the interaction between shadow possession and the wind style is not going to work? He works on the battlefield's environment. Shikamaru wins against Temari. Well, he doesn't necessarily win because he quits in the end, but he catches Temari with his shadow possession because of the environment surrounding them. We understand this is going to be a long-range fight, so essentially Temari only needed to be a long-range fighter for this fight to work, because the environment is going to do the rest when it comes to Shikamaru's strategy. It's a triple-layer strategy where Shikamaru fools Temari 3 times. First, he obviously retreats to the shadow side of the arena where he can use more of his shadow possession and extend his shadow further, and also to get some cover from Temari's wind style, obviously. He launches his shadow possession, and Temari understands that there is a limit for its range, which she marks on the ground. A few moments later, Shikamaru launches it again, and Temari is almost caught off guard because the shadow advances past the limit, because the sun is setting behind Shikamaru and the wall is making a greater shadow, so Shikamaru can extend his own shadow further. But Temari also understands that, so Shikamaru has to come up with a different way to extend his shadow, and then he uses his little vest. He creates this parachute, which he launches upward, and that creates a small shadow, which his shadow exiting the shadow from the wall can reach and then extend further, because that shadow is providing its extra shadow for it. And just seeing Shikamaru using the little vest as a parachute is one of the most interesting things that we see in the series so far when it comes to strategy. It's not something you would think of, but it's one of those things you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense, and it's really cool. But Temari manages to counter that. However, all Shikamaru was doing with his shadows up until that point was a fake out. He was only leading Temari to where he wanted her to be, because Temari hides behind her fan and she plans on baiting Shikamaru with a clone, but she is caught from behind. Turns out Shikamaru used the whole Naruto made on the ground to catch Neji in the previous fight in order to extend his shadow further and catch Temari completely from behind. So what he was doing before, by waiting the shadow of the wall to extend and also creating his parachute to extend his shadow even further, was all for the purposes of directing Temari close to the whole Naruto Naruto had created so that Shikamaru could catch her and finish the fight. And what Kishimoto accomplishes here with Shikamaru is astounding, because the dude has one jutsu in his arsenal. The shadow possession is all he has, and somehow this fight feels so energetic and smart because of how Shikamaru uses his environment to his advantage. And the entire thing about the sun setting, the vast parachute thingy, as well as Naruto's hole on the ground had to be planned out in advance for this fight.
I understand,
to really
that's
feel
hard
like
to
he's
remake.
a strategic genius, even though he has just one.
Like I said earlier, that is hard to remake. To remake a fight like that, you know what I'm saying? So, and he had some other fights that was pretty good like this, you know, the Sasuke retrieval arc and stuff like that, and then I think he had some fights in Shippuden as well.
Jutsu, and as a matter of fact, the fact that he only has one jutsu enhances it because he can use it in such a creative way. Now, the next Shikamaru fight is that fight against that squadron of sound ninjas, which uses a very clever trick by using twigs in order to fool them, making them think the dog is walking there because he creates the footprints with the sticks and also with himself to mimic the other humans, and then he catches them in the shadow possession. Now, admittedly, he didn't have much else to do in that situation because he was out of chakra, but Asuma saves him. And that's when you really see the character had a lot of limitations here, because he caught almost the entire enemy squadron with his shadow possession and he could just delay them there. The character needed a little bit more in his arsenal to keep fresh, otherwise Kishimoto would have to invent all sorts of weird things in the environment for every single Shikamaru fight. It's very believable in the Chunin exams against Temari, but if every time Shikamaru is gonna fight there's gonna be a very exotic, weird thing in the environment for him to win the fight, then it wouldn't feel as believable. So Kishimoto gives Shikamaru a more offensive jutsu, which is an extension of his shadow possession, the shadow strangulation jutsu, which he actually gets to see for the first time in the Chunin exams when Shikamaru's dad uses that jutsu against an invading enemy. Because this jutsu is going to be very important for Shikamaru's next major fight, and unlike in the fight against Temari, this fight is going to be focusing more on the enemy's abilities and not so much in the environment for Shikamaru's grand strategy. Tayuya is a very interesting opponent. She uses sound to control those large summons. The large summons can spit those ghosts that suck chakra off of you. She has auditory genjutsu, but one of the interesting things is that she is also a long-ranged fighter, which is pretty much all he's faced so far. He's only going to face a more short-range fighter in Naruto Shippuden when he faces Hidan. But for the Tayuya fight, Kishimoto crafted her powers very well. The first thing Shikamaru had to overcome in the fight was to understand how Tayuya was controlling those massive summons of hers, and Shikamaru deduces she is using her fingers as she plays the flute, and Shikamaru manages to memorize her fingers' movements in order to predict the movements of her summons, which grants the character this aura of intelligence. Well, he memorized the movements and he can predict them now. That's pretty intelligent and difficult to do in the middle of a fight, but well, this is not that difficult to write because sure, you can just say, well, the character memorized those things because he's intelligent. It's much harder to come up with a very intelligent strategy for Shikamaru to counter Tayuya's abilities, and he definitely does. He comes up with something even more intricate than what he did against Temari, and that's exactly what Kishimoto wanted to do. He always wants to one-up Shikamaru's strategic prowess in his fights. So in this fight, he's literally counting how many kunais and shurikens and paper bombs and flashbangs he has on his ninja pouch, because they're going to be very important. And when Tayuya attacks Shikamaru with her summons, after Shikamaru memorizes her finger movements, he starts to toss the kunais in several different directions, hitting some of the kunais on the forest, forcing Tayuya's summons to block a few of the kunais, but the positioning of the kunais was all to make sure Tayuya would attack Shikamaru the correct way for him. She launches a direct assault, but Shikamaru had tossed a kunai with a flashbang beforehand, and he uses that flashbang that's behind Tayuya's summons to extend their shadows so Shikamaru could simply connect his shadow to theirs without even having to use the shadow possession jutsu to extend his shadow forward, because the shadows from the summons are extending towards him. Shikamaru gains control of the three summons and attacks Tayuya, but obviously Tayuya just unsummons them. They may have been under Shikamaru's control, but they were Tayuya's summons, so Shikamaru summoned them. Shikamaru obviously predicted that. Shikamaru attacking Tayuya with her own summons was a distraction, because when he did so and when Tayuya unsummoned them, Shikamaru was already weaving his shadow possession around the trees in the forest outside of Tayuya's view to catch her from behind and start to strangle her with his shadow. So that strategy had several layers barriers to them so that Shikamaru could once again catch the enemy with his shadow possession, just like he did with Temari. But this time, it's a real enemy in a real fight. Shikamaru has to try and eliminate her, which he fails because Tayuya can resist Shikamaru's shadow possession as it was established before. It doesn't completely control you, can overpower it, and Shikamaru cannot strangle her as she activates the second stage of her curse mark and uses her auditory genjutsu on him, which works. And Shikamaru sees his arm melting in that weird genjutsu world. And as Tayuya jumps towards Shikamaru to finish him off, he breaks himself out of the genjutsu using his own shadow to break his finger, and now he can use the shadow possession from a much shorter range to catch Tayuya with it. The shorter the range, the more powerful his grasp is, and that was the final step of his strategy, to draw Tayuya in so that he could use his shadow with much more power. Now in the end, it didn't work because Tayuya was still overpowering him. If Temari hadn't arrived, Shikamaru would have lost the fight, which was very much thematic for Shikamaru's arc. Him losing there signified that, oh, he has to do better, he has to be a more effective leader, put more work into his training and things like that, because obviously he failed the mission, his friends almost died, and he lost his fight if it wasn't for Temari. But even though he quote-unquote lost to Tayuya, it still felt like a very intelligent fight with this multi-layer strategy, and the results resemble the results against Temari. But in here, obviously Shikamaru couldn't give up. He had to keep on fighting because he was going to die. He couldn't just, say, oh, I quit the fight. Overall, pretty great moment, and Kishimoto keeps on making Shikamaru create clever and clever strategies every time he fights. And you can see how Kishimoto crafted Tayuya's powers to suit what he needed to do for Shikamaru during the fight. Giving her summons that she can control with her fingers by playing the flute allowed for Shikamaru to deduce her movements and come with a grand strategy to capture them and use that as a distraction to catch Tayuya with his shadow possession. Also using the environment, not as much as in the Chunin Exams Arena now, but just using the trees to hide his shadow possession and catch Tayuya from behind. Tayuya's powers interacted in a very interesting way with Shikamaru by allowing Shikamaru to capture her summons, which was a very hyped moment during the fight, and also for Shikamaru to break himself out of the genjutsu using his own shadow, which is a very creative usage of his new shadow strangulation jutsu. Shikamaru's utility usage with the kunais and flashbangs was also one of the most interesting ever done in the series in this fight, and even though the guy has two jutsus now going for him, which are just two varieties of the same jutsu pretty much, it still feels like he's a mastermind when it comes to fights. But of course,
that makes his fight more interesting, even though he don't have much to work with.
Naruto Shippuden with his only fight. Well, he technically fights 2 times in Naruto Shippuden, 2 major fights, but they're all against the same opponent, Hidan. And out of every single opponent Shikamaru has ever faced, Hidan's powers were very much crafted for Shikamaru's strategic mind to work against them. In Shikamaru's first fight against him, Asuma is actually leading the squad and being the spearhead of the fight. Shikamaru is providing support and analyzing Hidan's movements. Now, Hidan's ritual is very intricate. He needs to draw blood from the enemy, drink that blood, and then draw the circle on the ground with a triangle inside to perform the ritual, and he has to be on the circle itself. There are several steps for that ritual, and Shikamaru manages to decipher pretty much all of them in their first fight. However, it's not enough, and Asuma still gets killed. Well, Shikamaru and Asuma would have won the fight if Kakuzu hadn't sewed Hidan's head back into his body, but still. Shikamaru deduces that Hidan needs to be on the circle in order to perform the ritual, so much so that they test the theory. Asuma tosses shuriken that nicks his ear when Shikamaru managed to pull him out of the circle, and it didn't hurt Asuma's ear, and obviously Shikamaru deduces how the jutsu is activated. So he has everything he needs to know for the second fight against Hidan and Kakuzu, in which he performs his grand strategy.
I like this.
The first
he set
thing
him
is
up
that
perfectly.
he prepares a battlefield in the forest where he's going to take Hidan, and we see that whenever he manages to separate Hidan from Kakuzu and arrives at the forest, it's filled with paper bombs all around, which Hidan doesn't take notice, but it's very obvious that Hidan went into enemy territory, so to speak. Regardless, Hidan is not the most intelligent opponent here. After all, Shikamaru managed to catch Hidan pretty much off guard in order to separate him from Kakuzu. He didn't expect Shikamaru to come in close and connect his shadow to Hidan's shadow by proximity and not by launching it. But when he reaches the forest, that's when the magic begins, because Hidan rushes Shikamaru after his shadow possession quote-unquote fades away because, oh no, my chakra. Obviously there was a feint by Shikamaru. Hidan rushes him and draws blood out of Shikamaru's cheek. He drinks the blood, he makes the ritual, and he pierces his own heart. Shikamaru pretends he got really hurt and he's going to die, but the blood was from Kakuzu, which Kakuzu Kakashi extracted beforehand whenever he Reikiri'd Kakuzu from behind and gave the blood to Shikamaru so that Shikamaru could use the blood on Hidan's own ritual without Hidan even knowing that he is taking away one of Kakuzu's hearts. Now, they didn't know Kakuzu's abilities before they went into the fight, and Kakashi could have really well thought that, okay, I killed this guy with my Reikiri, I don't even have to take the blood out of him now. Luckily, Kakashi did. He's a very cautious guy, and he gave the blood to Shikamaru so that he could perform the ritual. Now, I've seen some people saying that Shikamaru managing to hit the blood straight on Hidan's weapon as Hidan is swinging it is kind of ridiculous because it requires a lot of speed and coordination, but I mean, sure, it's a shonen. They do these sorts of things and they have superhuman reflexes, so that's fine. And well, after Shikamaru pretends he got killed by Hidan's ritual, he jumps and tries to behead Hidan, and then he uses the environment he had prepared beforehand in order to trap Hidan on several paper bombs and explodes Hidan in a very climactic and satisfying scene, burying him on that hole that Shikamaru dig before the fight, and he wins the fight and also helps Kakashi and the team against Kakuzu in the process. So not only does he finesse Hidan and Akatsuki member with strategy in a 1v1 fight, he is also fighting against Kakuzu in a way and helping his team in a fight that's happening a few miles away, I have to assume. And you can see how every single ability was crafted for that moment. Hidan drinking the blood, so oh, I can take the blood from someone else and give it to Hidan. He's not gonna know it is. I mean, it tastes like blood. How Kakuzu had several hearts, and how Shikamaru weaponizing Hidan's ritual against him but not completely kill him and take him out of the fight. And obviously the fact that Hidan is immortal plays very well first with the entire fighting that was going on. Oh god, we killed him, we beheaded him. Oh, actually no, he's still alive. So Shikamaru had to come up with something very clever in order to explode him into pieces so that he couldn't come back and bury him forever. Now, according to the data books, Hidan has died of malnutrition while he was buried there, but that's so stupid. It's much more interesting if he just stays there forever, cursed by his own curse. And that was pretty much Shikamaru's magnum opus in the Naruto series, his most impactful fight where he used the strategy to beat his opponent, and also an opponent far away, Akatsuki members at that. And it's actually the second fight in the series that Shikamaru wins, because of course he wins against Kin, but he actually loses all his fights after that.
I love
against
this moment,
Marituya and the first fight against Hidan and Kakuzu, so he wins this time. But you can see how Hidan's abilities had to be crafted for Shikamaru to come up with that strategy and for Shikamaru's fight to be satisfactory. And that's because, let's be real here, he still didn't have much of an arsenal. Sure, he can use the Sui shadows, but that doesn't really give him all that much more than he already had.
Right.
The entire strategy here revolved around how Shikamaru would counter Hidan's powers.
He's so
and he
smart.
didn't
it
even
makes
use his own shadows for that.
He makes it feel like he's more strong than he actually is.
And sleight of hand, because they didn't realize Kakashi had taken blood from Kakuzu, and they didn't realize Shikamaru put Kakuzu's blood on Hidan's blade. And that's why Shikamaru is so difficult to write for. Not necessarily because of his arc or personality. I'm pretty sure Kishimoto likes to do those
last
things, but coming up with new fights for Shikamaru to be intelligent on, seeing that he has to be intelligent in every single fight because that's his shtick, is extremely difficult. So much so that Shikamaru does not have a 1v1 ever again, which I have to say is kind of a waste. Yeah, it is difficult to come up with a fight for Shikamaru, but I think Kishimoto could have come up with something. Then again, Shikamaru is one of the few characters from the Konoha 12 members that got an end for their character arc in Naruto Shippuden, because most of them didn't. I mean, if you discount Naruto and Sasuke, obviously. Take a look at Lee, or Shino, or Ino, or Choji, or even Hinata. They did not get a satisfactory end for their character arcs. And yeah, Shikamaru's quote-unquote end comes in very early on in Naruto Shippuden, and there could have been other things that Kishimoto would do afterwards to develop Shikamaru's character further, but at least he got something. And it was very good, unlike Neji, who didn't do anything for the entirety of Naruto Shippuden, and then he just kind of randomly dies to a twig in the work. But after seeing how meticulously Kishimoto had to craft Shikamaru's opponents and their abilities in order for the fights to feel interesting, and also the environment Shikamaru was put into those fights, you can understand why it was a headache for Kishimoto to write Shikamaru, especially when he had to fight. That could have been solved by giving Shikamaru some more diverse powers, maybe something that's not completely related to shadows, but honestly, I think that would be quote-unquote cheating a bit. The thing about Shikamaru is that he doesn't have a lot in his arsenal, but he can produce so much with the little that he has because of his sheer intellect and just overall mentality of faking out his opponents just like a shinobi should do. And all that combined with his very good character arc, character themes, and also personality makes for great and memorable fights in the Naruto series, even if they may not be as important important as other fights like Shikamaru versus Temari, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't matter all that much. But because the character is so interesting and the strategy is so well thought out, it's extremely entertaining and it makes the series better for it. Watch this other video right here for more cool Naruto.
You find anyway, that was good fire video. I didn't know. I forgot how strategic his fights were. Shout out to Kishimoto. It is kind of hard to write for a character like that, for like to have fights that's all thought out and stuff. So yeah, I get that. So shout out to DygoKnight for this video. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe. Check out the last DygoKnight video right here. Check out some other videos you might like right here, and I'll catch y'all next time, man. Peace.